On July 25th, 2015, near-death researcher Dr. Raymond Moody led a symposium in Santa Cruz, California. It was called Life Beyond Life, New Views of the Near-Death Experience. Raymond and his wife Cheryl invited me as their guest, and I interviewed Raymond during a break. I apologize for the occasional audio interference. Dr. Moody, I'd like to thank you for this interview.
Thank you very much, Mel. I'm just delighted to be with you.
Yeah. Dr. Moody, I'd like to start out with how you grew up. And I understand you grew up in a family in which religion played absolutely no part.
Yeah.
Could you talk to us about that?
I am so fortunate that I really grew up pretty much entirely separated from religion. I'm from the deep south of the United States, but my father was a surgeon, number one, and a professional military officer, number two. And if you put those personalities together, you can sort of figure out my father's kind of person he was. And so he was very hostile, I would say, about religion and always making sarcastic comments about it. Mm-hmm. And my mother's mother was a very humorous person who was also not religious. And she was always making kind of humorous, but kindly humorous remarks about religion. So I really just, to me it was a mystery. From the time I was a kid, you would pass by these rather imposing buildings, and I had no idea what was going on in there, and it always seemed very alien to me. Mm-hmm. What I was fascinated with from the age of 7 was astronomy, and I think that was a big part of my awakening to life. Was at the age of 7, I built my own telescope and had a very dramatic experience. It's a very, very clear and vivid memory of looking at the Andromeda galaxy. I don't know how old I was, maybe 8 or 9 or somewhere in there. And I remember thinking, when I saw the Andromeda galaxy through a telescope, that I would never know much of anything. And I was very content with that. It just seemed to me from the very beginning that we live in a world where we're never going to know much of anything. And that's completely satisfying to me. And in a way, it has made the pursuit of knowledge even more fun, because I know I'm not trying to go toward some ultimate end of completion. I just enjoy knowing things and learning new things.
Did looking at the Andromeda galaxy elicit any kind of emotion in you? Any feeling of awe or wonder?
Yes, I would say awe. That we live in this universe. Even then I was beginning to understand about the concept of light year and how far away these things were, and realizing and the vastness of the heavens that I could kind of survey with this rather funny instrument that I made. I remember now I kind of laugh, but for an 8-year-old it was a pretty good telescope. And so awe was what I experienced, and that we live in this utterly baffling and incomprehensible universe has been part of my life experience from as early as I can remember.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Raymond, since then you've gone on to become what has been called the father, and I guess now the grandfather of the near-death experience. So, and I've done many interviews about the near-death experience, and I've interviewed people in the field who have researched it like you. And one person commented on one of my shows on the near-death experience. She said, after listening to numerous near-death experiences, it seems that there is no need for religion. Would you comment on that? Maybe distinguish between the difference between religion and spirituality?
You know something, I have a friend, Nathan Katz, who's a professor of religious studies. And a couple of years ago, I asked Nathan, what is religion? I'm not sure I ever have had a clear idea of what it's supposed to be in the first place. And he was saying to me that there are 7 criteria that define it for the scholars, and I forgot what they were, but one of them would be, for example, a set of doctrines and beliefs about the some other dimension of existence. And then there's other aspects of it, of course, the ritual aspect and so on. And I've never really had a very good sense or feeling of what that's all about as a sort of outsider. And, but what I can say, and this is very paradoxical for some people, but it's something I feel very deeply, and that is that I talk to God every day, and God has never said a word to me about religion. And that's kind of how I feel about it. I think religion is a human institution, which I think maybe has done some good things in the world, but I tend rather to look at the terrible things that it's brought about. So I try to, religion is just something I'm not interested in. I can imagine that there would be a state of the world where we could move beyond religion. Now, people distinguish between religion and spirituality. I'm not so clear that that is a very coherent distinction. But you know what I say, and it may sound evasive, but it's nonetheless what it's true of me, and that is that if somebody asked me, Raymond, do you believe that God exists? I say no, absolutely not. And then I go on to say, because, number one, I, Raymond Moody, am a limited human being. And I realized that any opinion or belief that I could formulate about God would be bound to be off base. And also, if you think about that question, do you believe that God exists? The emphasis of that sentence is on the word exist, right? Now, what I would say that as a logician, I could define for you the concept of existence. We can even put this into symbols. But I can't define to you the concept of God. To me, God is larger than the concept of existence. What I say is I have a relationship with God, and it doesn't involve any sort of beliefs or ideologies about anything. It's a relationship I practice in my daily life, and it's one that's very essential to me. But religion is something I've never even understood, because religious people tend to have opinions and to say that it's this way or that way. And I think, to me, that's rather ridiculous.
When you said you have a relationship with God, could you equally or almost equally say that God is an experience rather than a being?
Well, maybe that's a good way of saying it. Yeah, or is a relationship. And in terms of that notion of a being or an entity, well, I mean, I just don't think I'm in a position to know about that. Mm-hmm. But I am in a position to know about my relationship with God. And I could give you various examples, but here's one that comes to mind. I live in an old grist mill that was built in 1839, and I moved into it in 1990, May of 1990, and it had last been rewired in 1950. So I knew it needed rewiring, but at the time I didn't have the money. So 3 years and 4 months passed, and in September of 1993, my wife said to me, well, we can get the money together now to have it rewired, but we didn't know an electrician. So my wife and I held hands by our kitchen sink, and we prayed that God would send us just the right electrician. The next morning, the phone rang, and my wife picked up the phone, and she said, She said, hello, and on the other end, a voice said, hello, this is B.R. Wilson. And Cheryl said, yes, B.R.? What is it? And he said, well, your number just came up on my beeper. And Cheryl said, well, we haven't made any phone calls this morning, B.R. What's this all about? And B.R. said, well, I'm an electrician. And Cheryl said, well, B.R., we do need an electrician. Come on over. He was over within a short period of time. And I first saw B.R. When I was standing at the same place we delivered up the prayer, except I was looking in the opposite direction. And he came through our doorway from our dining area into the kitchen. And B.R. looked very puzzled, and he said, I sure do wish I knew how your number came up on my beeper. So I just blurted it out. I said, well, I'm sure it was God. Well, there B.R. kind of looked. Well, anyway, he went around the house and he made his inspection. And then we all went out onto the porch, and I sat on the porch. And B.R., my wife Cheryl, escorted B.R. out to his van. And within, I'm sure, less than a minute later, they were back up on the porch. And B.R. was looking kind of shaken. And my wife, who is a light complexion anyway, was looking as pale as the proverbial sheet. And what had happened was that as Cheryl was escorting B.R. into his van, he said, well, it's going to be a few days before I can come out here to start doing this, because he said, I come from a very close family around here, and we all love each other very much. And my 38-year-old brother had a heart attack on the way home, had a heart attack and died the other day, and my mother had a heart attack on the way home from the funeral home. And so my wife said, well, B.R., my husband might be able to help you with that. He talks with people who've been through that sort of thing. And B.R. said, well, my mother gave me this book called Life After Life to read, and it's helping some. Now, that was 23 years ago, and B.R. is still one of our dear friends. So not only did we got a good electrician, we also got a wonderful friend.
Wow.
And I could, sort of go through a lot of stories like that, and it's, to me, that's a relationship with God.
Yeah. Raymond, that's an incredible story, and I can't help but recall how you are keenly interested in the Greek philosophers and logic.
Yes.
What would they say about such a thing?
It's so funny because thank God we distinguish in this 21st century between the spiritual quest and the intellectual quest. But that is largely an artifact of being, fortunately, Americans who live in the society that was created by people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who insisted that the universities that they founded, the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Virginia, be divorced from the church and exist as a secular institution. And that had a lot to do with why in the modern world we think of these things as different, as the spiritual quest and the intellectual quest. But I doubt that Plato, for example, or Aristotle even, would have been able to make that distinction. They would have thought it was incoherent, because to them the intellectual quest and the spiritual quest were, I think, part of the same thing. And it's an attitude I've come to accept because logic, for example, I am a great lover of logic. And I just love logic. I've taught it, and the work that I do when I have time to be by myself and just do my work is logic. The specific logical question that I'm interested in is what makes things unintelligible? Like, what is the structure of nonsense?
Right.
So what I would say is that logic itself, according to its inventor, a man named Parmenides from around 500 BC, came here from the other side. Parmenides, by his account of it, received the fundamental concept of logic, which is the notion of truth, that is, that which is the case independently of what anybody thinks about it. in his visit to the other side when he was an evoker of the dead at these oracles of the dead. So to me, it's really, I think it's not possible to distinguish. It's, I think of them as just different aspects of the same quest.
Right. For many, many years, you've been interested in the question of life after death. And yet, that very statement is self-contradictory.
It is.
And so, what you're keenly interested in lately is coming up with new forms of rationality and logic that can help us understand what appears to be a contradiction, life after death. Would you comment on that?
I will, Mel, and I must say that when I was a kid, I fell in love with the work of a Disney artist named Carl Barks. And Carl Barks was the man who, when I was a kid and before, was the writer and artist of the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comic books. And I discovered in the pages of Carl Barks when I was a kid nonsense, which we associate a bad feeling tone with that word, but I think of nonsense in connection with Lewis Carroll and Dr. Seuss and so on as a whole domain of language. And to me, unintelligibility is just a wonderful experience. When I was a kid and I looked through the telescope and I realized that the natural question you pose to yourself is, what's the size and shape of this thing that we're in? Well, we all did this experiment when we were a kid. You go out in your mind right to the wall. But then you realize, but doesn't there have to be something on the other side of the wall? And then if you try to think of it, the only other plausible alternative, that it goes on and on forever, then that doesn't make any sense either. So very early in my life, I just was fascinated by nonsense and the unintelligible. I carried that forward throughout my life. When I was a graduate student in philosophy, I learned that one of the primary concepts of analytical philosophy is the notion of nonsense. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on this in 1969, and I have continued it forward to where what I have worked out is a logic of the unintelligible. It sounds self-contradictory, but probably largely because of Aristotle, who was apparently a very compulsive man, and he was horrified by nonsense. And his favorite word for nonsense was random talk. But even when I was an undergraduate philosophy student, I realized that nonsense, far from being random talk, is a highly patterned phenomenon. So to make a long story short, what I can confidently say now is that we have a logic whereby we are able to compute, to put it that way, sentences and statements that heretofore have been unintelligible and nonsensical. And I would put under that rubric the sentence like, there is life after death, which is self-contradictory. So my primary interest is in my logic and my logic of the unintelligible. And to me, the whole question of an afterlife that I've been engaged with is, I see it more as a corollary of the wider question of what is nonsense, because the sentence, there is life after death, is one kind of nonsense, a self-contradiction. But in my work, I have identified over 70 different patterns or types of nonsense, which in itself sounds like an incoherent remark until you listen to this. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble and the wabe. Right, now that's one type, but now listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. Or, listen to this, when you do this experiment, if you smell an odorless gas, it is carbon monoxide. Now, just in this 2-minute thing, we've seen that here's 3 different patterns of nonsense, right? I've identified over 70 different patterns of nonsense and have found the universal structural formula behind all of these. Now, What this has to do with the area I am most known for, which is the near-death experience, is that this gives us an entirely new way to investigate the afterlife question. And I can assure you that if we prepare people with a logic of the unintelligible, if we equip them in advance with logical and rational principles for thinking rationally about seemingly incomprehensible or unintelligible sentences, then let's say we teach people this logic, not from anything in connection with life after death, but simply because they want to enhance their critical thinking skills or whatever. Then the clock begins. Just by chance, some of them will have near-death experiences. And what I confidently conjecture is that under those circumstances, when they have a near-death experience with this logical background of an alternate logic of the nonsensical in their mind, that they will be able to articulate this experience in an entirely new way that has never been done before. Now, where that leads in terms of the rational investigation of an afterlife, I would have to at this point introduce the concept of parallax, which is an astronomical notion. But we all hear sentences like, it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri, right? We all know that kind of statement, but if you've ever sat back and thought about it for a minute, that's a rather odd statement, because how do you know that it's 4.3 light years to Alpha Centauri? You can't tie an odometer to a homing pigeon's leg and send it out there and back. So how do they know? Well, the way they know is through something called parallax. And if you think back to the 1920s, say, they knew by then, by the Newtonian mechanics, that it's about, on the average, 93 million miles from the Earth to the Sun. So that means that the diameter or the distance across the orbit of the Earth is about 186 million miles. So when the Earth was here on its orbit, they would carefully measure the angle to certain nearby stars, wait exactly 6 months, and measure the angle again. And you can see intuitively that there would be a little difference. So just by the geometry you learn, or the trigonometry you learned in high school, you can see that would give you a triangulation, right, and you can calculate the distance out there. And that works for certain nearby stars. But we can now do a similar maneuver with near-death experiences. We already have lots and lots of narratives of near-death experiences that were framed through the lens of Aristotelian logic. But in the not-too-distant future, we're going to have a different set of accounts of near-death experiences that are framed not just through the Aristotelian lens, but also through this logic of nonsense lens, and that by comparing these two, that will give us a little opening to look at this notion of an afterlife from two separate perspectives.
Raymond, when I consider the near-death experiencers that I've interviewed, all of them say that their experience is ineffable.
Yes.
It can't be put into words or any kind of logic. So if it was possible for them to come up with some kind of logic or some kind of vocabulary to explain what they've experienced, it would be intelligible to themselves.
Yes.
But I can't see that it would be intelligible to someone who has not had the experience.
Well, you see, this is my point, that this is not something, it's a logic that's not just going to be learned by people with near-death experiences. It will be a logical code or a set of rational principles that are generally dispersed. And out of those people who know this, some will have near-death experiences. And the connecting link that you mentioned there, you see, will be the logic of nonsense, since both the people who have and who haven't have a grounding in the rational principles of unintelligibility, as it were. This will give us a slight displacement so that we can compare the two states. Now, I'm not saying this is going to be proof of life after death or anything, but I think that this will be a breakthrough in equipping ourselves as a species to talk in a rationally intelligible way about ideas that don't make intelligible sense.
Mm-hmm. Raymond, you've had a diverse educational background, and I understand that you were a forensic psychiatrist in
Yes.
a locked ward for the criminally insane.
Yes.
You must be able to see something in the near-death experience that is deeply sane for you, because these people come back changed.
Yes.
And their view of reality is not the same as it was before.
That's right.
So, what is particularly sane about near-death experiencers after their experience and after they've integrated that into their lives?
Well, as the people I know who've had near-death experiences tell me, and I'm sure that you've heard the same thing, that this doesn't make you a saint, and you still come back with plenty of questions and
Right.
plenty of things you don't know.
That does make you humble.
It does make you humble. And I've got to say, too, that of the people I've known in my life, I think the most mentally well put together and emotionally well put together people that I've ever known in my life were people who've had profound near-death experiences. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make people saints, and they still have troubles and so on, but I think in a way the state of consciousness that people reach when they are in this state, which their physicians may identify as death, seems to be hyper-sane, perhaps, or even more sane than the ordinary sane state of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Near-death experiencers report a unique experience of the present, of what we would call the now. You know, you try and identify what the now is, and you really can't identify it. You can, try and locate it, but it's really quite elusive.
It is.
So what is it about the now or the present that can really only be experienced, apparently, in a state where you're technically dead?
Yeah, that's a big one. And from the very beginning of philosophy, there's been this insight among the great philosophers. There's something drastically wrong with the notion of time. As Aristotle said about time, he said, the future, the past is gone, the future isn't yet, and the present is hard to get a handle on. So what is time? And I find it very interesting that David Deutsch, for example, said not long ago that the notion of time, and especially the notion of the flow of time, is so deeply embedded in common sense that we'll probably never get rid of it. But nonetheless, he said, the notion of the flow of time is nonsensical. That is the fact. Because as soon as you start thinking of time, you realize that there's something just really strange about that notion. And I think one of the things about people with near-death experiences is that they have had direct personal experience of that. Because people say in their near-death experience that there's no such thing as time in that state of consciousness, that they have to relate their experience as though it were a sequence. But in the experiencing of it, it's not sequential, that time dissolves in this other realm of existence. I remember being very impressed as an undergraduate reading Kant, who was trying to figure out what time is, and he's like, where is time? And he was tracking it around, well, where is time? And then he said, oh, it's here, right? We think of time as something out there, but actually time is just part of the system that we have for being conscious of things. So I don't think of it as a physical constant, but of a sort of precondition of having a conscious experience, perhaps.
Right.
At least in this realm. I mean, people have a conscious experience in the next realm, but it's not time-based. And as long as we are in that, captivated by that time notion, we're here. But apparently, as soon as we're out of our body, there's no such thing as time, which makes, in a way, the notion of life after death rather self-contradictory, right? Because it's not that these people had a life after death, but rather that they have consciousness in some sort of realm of existence that is atemporal and aspatial.
And that suggests that perhaps consciousness is not produced by the brain?
Yes, Mel, I love medicine. I studied the neurosciences. I have dissected brains myself. I mean, I understand that realm of existence. But in terms of the bigger picture, even when I was a kid, I realized very early in life that I can be certain that I'm conscious now. I know that. But to move beyond that into some externally physical existence, that's a big inferential step. What I think about the external world, it has to do with the recurrent patterns in my consciousness. But it's just an inference to say that there is an external world. The matter, which we think of as something as the ultimately concrete thing. If you start thinking about matter, you quickly realize that the notion of matter is an abstraction, right? It is that which occupies space and has mass. Well, those are very contemporary notions in a way. It's a very paradoxical thing to relate, but nonetheless true, that Aristotle had no concept of space. He had a notion of place, that the book can be on the table, but the notion of an abstraction of void or empty space and so on was something that was not only incomprehensible to him, but actually sort of abhorrent. So we are dealing here with mass and space and time and matter and these basic fundamental constants with a philosophical or an abstract system of concepts which are self-consistent. That is, if you build a cyclotron, the rule seems to be that when you fire it up, that there will be a certain pattern appears on the oscilloscope. But to make the philosophical judgment beyond that that we live in a world where the consciousness is supposedly generated by the material substance of the brain, I just don't buy it. I mean, to me, it's physicalism is a philosophy. It's not I think in this world in American society, we're captivated by scientism, right, which is the doctrine that the only rational way of securing truth and searching for knowledge is by scientific method. And I used to teach epistemology, and which is the theory of knowledge. And so when I would ask the first few days of class, I would ask my students, well, what is knowledge? As you can easily imagine, a lot of them came up with science. Oh, knowledge is science. So I would say this. I would say, well, tell me what you mean. And eventually what they would say is that scientific method is the only rational means of securing truth and knowledge. And so I would write that up on the board, and I would say, was this what you think? And they would say, yeah. So then I would draw a rectangle around that statement, and I would say, well, how would you know that? Now, if you think about it, the statement, scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge and truth. How do you know that? there's only two answers they could give. They could say, well, I know it by the scientific method, but that's the fallacy of reasoning in a circle, or petitio principii, which is assuming what you set out to prove. But on the other hand, if they answered the question, well, I know it by philosophy or literary theory or the law or history, then that would be a contradictory remark. So scientism is something that a lot of people in this society value very deeply, but they've never thought it through, because there have to be other rational means of securing knowledge, even to know that scientific method works. So I love science, by the way. I mean, oh my God, from the time I was 7 years old, just captivated, as I still am, by astronomy. And I love physics and chemistry and all these things I've studied. But to make science your ideology of life is an inherently self-defeating move. To me, science is a wonderful method for capturing the truth about certain areas of existence, but not about other areas of existence. So, for example, the question of whether there is life after death, in my opinion, would be the most important question of all, and yet it is not a scientific question, right? Because you can't think of a way to verify that.
That's been attempted by people putting codes on top of cabinets in emergency rooms, and they've had no results at all.
Yes, and also, Mel, I think that there is also a fundamental incoherence with that. And, you can't say that there should be some sort of rule that medical doctors should have to take a few philosophy courses before they start fooling around with the afterlife question, but they really should, because, you see, it's very easy for somebody to say, well, if we just put the item up on the shelf and the person got out of their body and they could accurately tell us what was up there, then that would be proof of life after death. That misses so many steps, and it shows very clearly that they have never read their Plato, who says in the Phaedo very clearly that even if you could prove that the mind or the soul leaves the body at this point, that wouldn't prove that there's life after death. Why? Because how do you know that, for a few seconds during the dying process, this thing moves away from the body, but that doesn't prove anything about what happens after that body is totally sent to the morgue. Mm-hmm. So you see, the trouble with parapsychology is, that is a pseudoscience. And the pseudoscience of parapsychology, in my opinion, is one of the main reasons why we're stuck on the afterlife question. For example, the thing they often use, and even the so-called skeptics, who are not skeptics at all in the philosophical sense, but
how do you mean that? They're not skeptics in the philosophical sense at all?
Well, that word skeptic has been kidnapped, sadly, by a bunch of entertainers and magicians and people who are sort of feel the allure of the paranormal and who've studied physics or whatever and are into this, but they don't feel, it's kind of unseemly, so they've got to affect this thing. It's the brain damage, the cutoff of the oxygen flow to the brain.
What is the original meaning of the word skeptic?
Yes, the original skeptic was Pyrrho of Athens, Pyrrho, and Pyrrho was a member of one of the four schools of Hellenistic philosophy, so-called, after the conquest of Egypt and the rest of the world by Alexander. That was the Hellenistic period in Greece. And Aristotle had formulated logic and codified logic. About 20 years later, Pyrrho formed the skeptical movement. And this was Pyrrho's insight. Pyrrho knew logic very well. That's no problem. And so what logic is a set of rules and procedures for drawing conclusions, right? So what the skeptics asked was, Well, what if you don't draw the conclusion? In other words, you know logic very well, but your technique is to avoid a conclusion. They even had these manuals to tell you how to do it. Like, don't conclude that's a chair there. It might be a cardboard cutout or an optical illusion or a whatever. And they found that by assiduously practicing this, by not drawing a conclusion about anything, that two things would happen, both of which I can attest to, because I've been a skeptic really since I was a philosophy major. But two things that happen. Number one, there is a very unique mind-expanding experience that's connected with being a skeptic. Hume mentioned this a little bit. But secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, if you think of it geometrically and everybody else is rushing in this direction to get to the conclusion, but your procedure is to withhold a conclusion, then if you think about it, that opens up side pathways of inquiry. You see that everybody else had missed because they're going in this direction. So, knowing those two things, if you put together what these so-called skeptics say about near-death experience, they say, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Now, if you unpack what that person says, basically it boils down to, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. It's very easy for people who don't have much philosophical background to get into absurdities in this kind of thing, even if you do have a philosophical background. So I sort of resent these pseudo-skeptics, as I call them. And they tend to be magicians who aren't very well educated and who are sort of Houdini wannabes. They kind of fancy themselves like Houdini. Or people, as I said, who may have a scientific background but who are somehow drawn to this world of the paranormal, but in a negative way, and they come up with all these pseudo-explanations. But what we need in this question of an afterlife is an actual skeptic.
Right. Raymond, you've been talking with people who have near-death experiences for a very long time. I'd like to ask you, how has your life changed as a result of this?
You know, Mel, that's a very interesting question, because in one way, it's very hard for me to say, because I was 19 years old when I heard my first near-death experience from George Ritchie. Mm-hmm. And so therefore it happened to me at such an early phase in life that it's kind of hard to separate the two things, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. But where my struggle with this, not any sort of agonizing thing, but I guess it was a process. Since I didn't have a religious background, to me the whole notion of an afterlife was just so incredibly bizarre. So where I have found it's been like through a series of stages. Like, for years and years I heard these things and I took the people seriously, because you and I both know that whatever this is, at least the people to whom it happens, to them they think it's a reality for sure. And I was very impressed with that from the very beginning, but I didn't know whether it was real or not, whatever the notion of reality may be. But what happened to me was just, over a long period of time, I just didn't know what to think about it. And then about maybe 4 years ago, I heard a case of a man who had a very profound near-death experience, and in which his wife was killed in this terrible accident. And when he got up the courage to tell his doctor about it, the trauma surgeon who saved his life, the trauma surgeon became very solemn and said, well, I've never told anybody this, but that night you came into the hospital, I knew you weren't going to die because I talked to your wife in the operating room who had been killed in the accident. Mm-hmm. And other things like that. I hear this from my medical colleagues all the time.
But in addition to that, I think the scrub nurse had a similar experience.
She did.
What was her experience?
Her experience was, she said she did not see the wife, but she heard the wife talking. the scrub nurse and the procedure. Recently, it's say 3 months ago, I was in Italy and I talked with this very distinguished looking surgeon, and what I would call a rigid body posture, you know, rather uptight guy, as sometimes surgeons have that personality, rather rigid, and he was tall too, so it's kind of impressive looking up at him, and he came up to me, and this was after my lecture on near-death experiences, and he had what I can only call a haunted look in his eyes, and not in a negative way. It was just like you could tell that he was trying to figure out something that was beyond him. And he got me over into the corner, right, like he doesn't want anybody else to hear this. Right. And he talked to me about just a few months before, he had been doing an elective surgery on a man. I forgot what the surgery was, but it was a fairly, not a serious procedure at all. And the man was fairly young and in a good state of health, so there was never any question of there being a complication with the surgery. But in the event, the patient had a cardiac arrest on the table, and the surgeon was unable to resuscitate him, even after really, really trying. So he was just astonished, and he said he was just in a state of shock, and he was writing out the death certificate, and he was trying to think, well, what am I going to say to the family? When all of a sudden, he said, the double doors of the operating suite swung open, and a woman that he first identified as a raving lunatic, he thought this was a psychotic person who had forced her way into the operating room. But she came in, and he said he was trying to make out what she was saying, and then he realized she was saying that she was his patient's wife, and that she had been out in the waiting room, and that her husband had come to her saying, the doctor thinks I'm dead. Go in there and tell the doctor I'm not dead, because he thinks I'm dead. So she pushed her way down the corridor and into the operating room and started yelling this to the surgeon. And the surgeon told me that he was so discombobulated and taken aback, he automatically, without even thinking, he started the resuscitation again. And he said, to his utter astonishment, after a while, this guy came back. So he said when the patient was in the recovery room, he went there, and he said when this patient came out of this, the first thing he said to the doctor was, when you thought I was dead, I was out of my body and you couldn't hear me, so I went down to the waiting room and I tried to tell my wife to come in here and tell you that I was alive. And, you know, Mel, I can think of ways around that. I mean, I can think that, well, you know, maybe this first case we mentioned, maybe the doctor and the scrub nurse were having a concurrent psychotic episode at the same time the patient was having a near-death experience, or perhaps
a mass hallucination of
a
ghosts.
mass hallucination or whatever. But you know, that's just uncomfortable to me. It's like, it seems to me that the most intellectually honest thing to say at this point is that something is going on here that we don't understand, and that maybe we don't even yet have fully the logical and intellectual tools to begin to understand it.
Well, I wonder how we get those psychological and philosophical tools. What would it take?
That's coming, Mel. That's coming. And let me make a little prediction here.
Okay.
I bet that I could gather 20 people. But now I would have to choose them, okay? And they couldn't be New Agers. They couldn't be people who have an interest in the paranormal or in near-death experiences or anything.
Why not?
Because, I don't know about you, but my impression of this New Age mentality is that it's not very serious.
Right.
And that these are not very critical thinking people. But I would say that I could get 20 people together whose interest is in critical thinking, and it's not presented in any aspect in terms of near-death experiences or anything, but rather in terms of just, we're going to do these exercises that let's increase our critical thinking skills. That would be the entree. And I bet you that in a day, in a very controlled environment, we could take people through this, and at the end of the day, we would have some questions for them and ask, and one of the, say, 20 questions would be, do you think that this is a genuine breakthrough in the rational investigation of the afterlife question? And I bet you we'd get the answer is yes. Is what we got to do to get serious about the afterlife question is to work on our own cognitive equipment and to look at it in a wholly new way.
Okay, on that note, I think we'll conclude this interview. So, Raymond, thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much. No, this is great.
Thanks
Yeah.
again.